Sure, it's good to be with you. I have anticipated this meeting for some time, and so when I finally arrived, we didn't realize all the ins and outs and all the little nuances that we'd face in various airports, but we finally made it here. And after a good night's rest last night, we think we're acclimated to the time change. The jet lag is behind us, and so if I mess up, I can't blame anything on jet lag. I want to say a word or two about what I'm going to do this morning in the Bible class arrangement, because really, when preachers hold gospel meetings and we get an opportunity to speak in a combined class like this in an auditorium, really just another sermon. So that's the reason I'm standing up here where I am. I may move around a little bit. I am from the South originally, and so have a little different approaches. I hope you would appreciate that as we get underway. And it's good to be with the Stephen and Kelly and their family, and appreciate them and love them and have respected them for so many years and their work in the vineyard and our relationship with them. And so it's good. The Wallace family, just a fantastic family. I want to start our study this morning by reading with you from the 19th chapter of the book of Matthew. And so if you have a Bible handy, you might want to read along with me. I'm going to be reading from the New King James Version. These are verses that are extremely familiar to the people of God. But at the same time, when I acknowledge the familiarity of these verses, we have to recognize that according to some, these verses are so ambiguous as to lose its meaning. But I don't believe that, but I think it's pretty straightforward here, because Jesus is confronted by the Pharisees who became antagonistic to him during his ministry. And they came to him in verse 3 of Matthew 19. We'll pick up at verse 3. They came to him testing him and saying to him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?" And he answered and said to them, "Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." They said to him, "Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away?" And he said to them, "Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." So we'll suspend our reading right there. And really, this lesson is not going to be directed as to divorce. I recognize that we could spend a great deal of time talking about the permanency of marriage and the fact that divorce is permitted for one reason only. But I want to go in a different direction in our study this morning, and just point out to you that what was at one time considered to be the cornerstone of civilization, the family, is no longer viewed that way today. I think you know it as well as do I. Marriage and the family today is not even understood. We used to be able to be on the same page when we talked about a family. We talk about a traditional family, and now we're not even sure what a traditional family is. So what is a traditional family? And this is something that, we need to kind of begin our study by talking about. Merriam-Webster says, in definition to a traditional family, that it is the basic unit in society traditionally consisting of two parents raising their children. So that's what we consider to be, or that's what has always considered to be, a traditional family. However, among, people today in our society, and even among Christians, it's not always viewed that way. We talk about, the different ideas that people have about family. Well, family may mean this to one person, family may mean that to another person. And so there's just this confusion as far as what a family is. Do you realize that only 21% of American families are made up of a working dad and a stay-at-home mom looking out for the children? As a matter of fact, stay-at-home dads were one time considered an anomaly, because in 1970, only 1 out of 100 stay-at-home parents was the father. Today, that's 1 in 7. And so you see the shift from this idea of a traditional family. Nearly 40% of all births were to unmarried women last year. And this shows an increase that's going on, on a consistent basis. And then you have the so-called same-sex marriages between 2 men or 2 women. And then you have the transgender issue that comes into this, and you have blended families, and you have all kinds of issues today. So when you talk about a traditional nuclear family, people, what are you talking about? Well, what I'm trying to talk about is what the Bible has to say about families. Because really, right now, what we're dealing with, especially among churches of Christ, we're dealing with the subject of divorce. That is, who is permitted to divorce? What is a scriptural divorce? What is an unscriptural divorce? Is this a scriptural marriage as a result of this divorce? And on and on and on. And churches are trying to accommodate that. We're seeing churches that now have ministries to the divorced. They have ministries to the children of divorce. And all of these kinds of issues that have erupted. And so what I'm saying is, why can't we prevent that? Why can't we step in and prevent all of these peripheral issues that we're having to battle and all of these little fires that we're having to put out? Why can't we just say, let's get back to what the Bible says about marriage, and let's respect it as what God created it to be, and maybe we won't have all these other issues that we're going to have to deal with. So how can we keep the marriage together? And this is where I'm going this morning. This is what I want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you about some things that we can do to keep the marriage together. Because I got to tell you something. What Jesus said in Matthew 19 is easy to be understood. What part of this do we not understand? What God has joined together, let not man separate. I got to tell you something. That's pretty easy to be understood. It's pretty clear. Jesus is basing that upon what happens back in Genesis chapter 2, and we'll get to that in a moment too. But now, how can we, as the people of God, and how can we as husbands and wives and families, how can we keep this together? And how can we not become a statistic? What are some things that we can do? I'm going to, in the process of our study this morning, I'm going to deal with 3 things that I believe are critically important, to keep our marriages together and to keep our families intact. And I'm going to break these down into 3 charts, and each chart is going to have something, some more than 1 or 2 things on those charts. But nevertheless, it's going to be 3 things that I want to talk about. If we're going to be able to keep our marriage together, I want to say, let's start right here. Let's start, before we get married, with making a prenuptial agreement. Now, hold on. I don't mean by that what society means by a prenuptial agreement. A prenuptial agreement in society is an agreement that's in written form. When this marriage goes south, then I brought this into it, it's going to be mine. You brought that into it, it's going to be yours. And this is how we'll divide the estate. I'm not talking about that, because that is something I'm totally against. Because that suggests that I'm looking at this marriage as though it's going to fail. We can't do that. So the prenuptial agreement that I'm talking about is, before we marry, let's agree that our marriage is going to be a covenant relationship. This is where we need to begin. Our marriage is going to be a covenant. Jesus, when he was asked the question, is it lawful to divorce for just any reason? What Jesus did is very, very revealing. Because I got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, he didn't deal with Roman culture. He didn't even deal with Jewish culture. Jesus goes back to the beginning and he says, have you not read? Get your Bibles out, is what he's saying. Have you not read that he, that is God, who made them at the beginning, made them male and female, and said for this cause? For what cause? God made them male and female. For this cause, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And look at it. You see back in Genesis chapter 22, when God created this thing that we call marriage, this is what Jesus was referencing. And this marriage that Jesus is referencing is a covenant. Malachi 2 and verse 14. She is the wife by covenant, is what God says. What is a covenant? I want to just think about what we talk about a covenant. What are we talking about here? We can talk about, we can just think about, some housing additions have what they call a covenant. And so that is an agreement that you make when you move in there. You can't do this, or you can't do that, or you can do this, and you can't do that. So we find it's kind of like a contract when you think about it in that sort of way. So what Jesus is doing here is letting people know, and this is what we need to bring into the marriage, letting people know that this relationship we're entering into, it's not a merely human institution. It is divine. God created it. Furthermore, it's not a product of societal evolution. That is, when did sometime back in the past did man and woman decide to develop a monogamous relationship? No, that goes back to the beginning. It goes back to the very beginning. And it's not anything to do with racism. It has nothing to do with race. This is what God created at the beginning. It began with God. And man and woman comes into this relationship. They're forming a covenant. That is, they're forming an agreement that we're going to live together as husband and wife. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 4 and 5. If you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. For God has no pleasure in fools. Vow or pay what you have vowed. It is better not to vow than to vow and not pay. I realize he's not talking about the marriage covenant in that particular context. He's talking about the making of vows, and this is exactly what we do when we get married. We vow. We vow to God and we vow to one another. It's kind of like this. Okay, now we're going to transport all ourselves right now to a wedding. We're at a wedding. And you've got this man and woman standing before the officiant. And it goes something like this. Dearly beloved, we're gathered here together in the presence of these witnesses and in the presence of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. You get this? We're witnessing something, and we're calling upon God to witness this. And then there's the exchanging of vows. There may be some words that are said prior to that, but then you get down to the exchanging of vows. Will you join right hands? And will you repeat after me? And says to the husband, do you promise? Do you promise to love, to honor, and to cherish this woman whose right hand you now hold? Do you promise to be faithful to her, forsaking all others and cleaving unto her and to her only as long as you both shall live, in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer? And when a man stands up and says, I do, he's vowing to God, this is what I'm going to bring into this marriage. And to the woman, do you promise to love, to honor, and obey this man whose right hand you now hold? Do you promise to be faithful to him, forsaking all others, and cleaving unto him and to him only, as long as you both shall live, for richer, for poor, for better, for worse? I do. She's vowed to God. She's vowed to her husband. This is true. He's vowed to his wife. This is true. But you have vowed to God. And you know what? You and I better have the moral integrity to live up to the vows that we have made, because we have formed a covenant. So, before two people get married, you need to understand, this is what we're entering into. This is the relationship that we're entering into. This is a covenant. It's a lifetime agreement that we have made to each other, no matter what. Make a prenuptial agreement. Also agree to make your marriage successful. Paul talks in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 10 and 11, that a woman is not to divorce her husband. And a man is not to divorce his wife. That's said pretty clearly in those particular verses. And so what that tells me is, I don't have the liberty when things go kind of bad in this. Now, I'm not talking about, again, keep in mind, we're not dealing with verse 9 as to adultery, allowing the innocent to put away the adulterer and marry. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when these issues that begin to erupt in a marriage and problems begin to happen. Maybe it's money problems. Maybe it's the marriage bed problems. Maybe it's children problems. A lot of problems begin to exist in a family. So I don't have the liberty to just say, okay, time out. We'll just divorce. We'll just call this thing quits. No. Remember the vow I made to God? I vowed to God, I'm going to work it out. For better or for worse, I'm going to work it out. That's the promise that I made to God. And so I just don't have the liberty to walk away from this. And so what I need to do is expect that my marriage will be successful, and I need to work at making it successful. And it is a work. It is something that we have to engage in. I remember teaching a class several years ago as a young married class, and I asked the students in that class to tell me, write down, what do you expect out of your marriage? And you get a lot of good answers out of that. But this one guy in particular, I remember what he said. And he said, well, I expect my wife to have supper ready when I want it, and to keep my clothes clean and ironed. I'm thinking, okay, now this marriage is going to be kind of, rocky. If that's all you expect out of the marriage, well, what do you expect out of your marriage? Well, what are some things that you expect? Because you've entered into this relationship, you've entered this agreement, so what do you expect? Well, I'll tell you some of the things. I expect my wife to be faithful to me. She vowed that. I expect my wife to stand with me in sickness and in health. She vowed that. These are things that I expect. And so what we need to do is expect some great things in our marriage. And one of the things that we need to expect is we're going to work together to solve any problems that arise. And we're going to handle any difficulties that come along. We're going to try to take care of that. We're not going to divorce. We're not just going to walk away from this. So this is an agreement you have to make, a prenuptial agreement. Agree to fulfill your roles. Husbands are to be the head. Paul says this in Ephesians chapter 5. Man is the head of the wife. It's said clearly, he's to love his wife as Christ loved the church. She's to be in submission to her husband as the church is to Christ. This is said throughout the 5th chapter of the book of Ephesians. These are not suggestions. These are commands. And a man is to provide loving leadership, and a wife is to provide loving submission. I've spent some time in both Nigeria and Ethiopia and preaching in those countries. And one of the things that I noticed, it doesn't make any difference about the culture. It doesn't really make any difference about the society in which you're working in those areas. One thing becomes very clear. There is a definite distinction of roles. in every culture that I've seen. A definite distinction of role. It's only in Western culture that we see a blending of these things, and it's not good. Anytime there's role reversal in a family, you're asking for problems and difficulties. And a lot of problems that I see and try to deal with as far as couples are concerned is when they lose sight of what their roles are in a marriage relationship. There's certain distinctive roles. God is clear about that. And so if I want to keep my marriage together, what I need to do is I need to agree that this is a covenant that we have formed. I need to agree that I'm going to do everything I can to make this successful and expect my wife to do the same. And she has the right to expect that of me. And thirdly, I'm going to recognize what my roles are. And I'm going to live up to what God says my roles are to be. So this is where we need to go. We're going to keep our marriage together? Good place to start, right here. But now let's shift that just a little. Second thing we need to do is try to be wiser than Solomon. You say, well, Joe, how are you going to do that? Solomon, according to 1 Kings 3, is about the wisest guy that ever lived. There's no question about that. I'm going to grant you that. 1 Kings 3, verses 5 through 12. God tells Solomon, give whatever you want. He asked for a discerning heart. He's wise. He's the wisest man. People came from all over just to be amazed at his wisdom. But when it come to marriage, he didn't use a lot of wisdom. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 4, that he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And as a result of those 700 wives, his heart was turned away from God. And he did not serve God and did not love God with his whole heart. And so what we need to do is recognize some things about that may give us a little insight here. Let's go back to Genesis 2. As a matter of fact, since this is sort of an informal Bible class, I'm going to ask a question, and if you feel comfortable answering the question, well then I'd like for you to do that. But now when God created the world in 6 days, and I do believe in the 6 days of creation, when God created the world in 6 days, what did he say after each day of creation? He looked at his creation and he said what? It is good. God said it is good. Now, when God created everything, what did God look at and say, this is not good? We said, well, JR, you said everything is good. Well, God said there's one thing that wasn't good. Does anybody know what it was? That's right. Genesis 2 and verse 18, God said it is not good for a man to be alone. It is not good for a man to be alone. Now, what God did is he did not create 700 helpers. As a matter of fact, God, after God said that, God brought all the animals to Adam. And Adam saw that, that I don't have a helper comparable. God created a woman to be a helper for man. When God said it's not good for man to be alone, God knew what man needed. And he needed a companion that was like him, but different from him. I think sometimes heard Ron Daly say one time in a sermon dealing with this question, he said, when God created Eve and brought her to the man, and he named her woman, he said, maybe we need to break that down. And he looked at her and he said, whoa, man. You have to think about that. But anyway, God created a woman to be a helper for a man. It's not good for a man to be alone. And we need to recognize what this involves, what this entails. You see, when we're talking about, one man for one woman, and that's what we're talking about. We're talking about one man, one woman, One lifetime. That's what God created. And that's what we need to preserve. Remember, they asked Jesus, well, why did Moses command us to give a... Moses didn't command it. Moses permitted it because of the hardness of your heart. But from the beginning, it has not been so. And so we enter into a marriage relationship. We need to recognize that this is permanent. This is permanent. I don't have the liberty to get out of it and get another. I just don't have that liberty. Jesus said, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And then also, you need to understand that what you formed here not only is a covenant, but a companionship. You know, companion is a word that has been totally annihilated. And it's disgusting. People talk about in a same-sex relationship, well, this is my companion. No. That's not a companion. And we talk about our pets being companions. Well, my little Jack Russell is my companion. No, he may be very special to you, but he's not a companion to you. Because God created man and woman to be companions. And we need not abuse that word and make it apply to everything under the sun. Because a companion is what our spouse is to us. It's what Malachi 2 and verse 14, she is your companion, your wife by covenant. You know, as a matter of fact, the word companion actually comes from a Latin word, com, which means with, and panis, which means bread or food. And so that's the reason that a lot of times that's kind of, you know, maybe even referred to as fellowship or communion. But in the marriage relationship, it's intimacy. Is what companionship is. It's intimacy. And yes, it may involve the marriage bed. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. You know, you cannot defraud your husband or you cannot defraud your wife from the marriage bed. That's wrong. That's sinful. As a matter of fact, marriage bed is good and it's healthy and it's natural and it's normal. It's created by God. But intimacy, companionship, goes even beyond the marriage bed. Companionship. Companionship is two becoming one. It's becoming one in thought, one in intent, one in purpose. It's one. These two become one flesh, Jesus said. And we've got to make that mean a lot more than just simply the intimacy in a marriage bed. It's the intimacy that is created within two people, coming together as one in intent, in thought, in drive, in hope. Because if we get away from that, I mean, we're getting away from something very special in the marriage relationship. I was raised for the first 8 years of my life by my maternal grandparents. There's an interesting story to all of that, but I'll not get into that. And so my grandparents were, for the first 8 years of my life, just like my parents. As a matter of fact, I would call my granddad and my grandmother Dad and Mom for those first 8 years of my life. My granddad passed away at 56 of an aneurysm. My grandmother was widowed at 53. And I can remember when my granddad died, and I was living with my parents at the time, and we drove down to the country where grandmother and granddad lived. My grandmother was a tiny woman. And when I walked in to where grandmother was after we found out that granddad had died, she came up to me and she embraced me, and we were about the same size. I was about 12, 13 years old at the time. And she said this to me. She said, honey, I want you to know that I have lost my best friend. I had no idea what grandmother meant when she said that, until I met and married my best friend. If your spouse is not just someone you love and someone you desire, but if your spouse is not your best friend, you do not share intimacy. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 5 and verse 16, he said, "This is my beloved, and my beloved is my friend." This is intimacy. This is one flesh. So, you leave and you be joined, or you cleave, or you glue to that spouse. Cut the apron strings. And parents, when your children get married, don't butt in, because you just cause problems when you do that. And what you need to do when you get married is nurture the companionship. Don't grow apart from each other. You see, don't make the children the center of your life. Don't make your job the center of your life. Make each other the center of your life. Be wiser than Solomon. And then finally, learn how to communicate with each other. And this is a real problem that I see among people who even claim to be Christians. They don't know how to communicate with each other. I like to point people to the 4th chapter of the book of Ephesians. But you say, well, JR, chapter 5 is talking about the marriage relationship. I get that. But chapter 4 is talking about how you conduct yourself as a Christian. And if you will bring these Christian virtues into your marriage, then you're going to have success. Now, I want you to notice in Ephesians 4, Paul said in verse 22, "You put off concerning your former conduct the old man which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind. You put on the new man which was created according to God in true righteousness and holiness." He said, you're a Christian now. There's some traits that you need to have. And let's apply what he goes on to say to the marriage relationship. Always tell the truth to each other. Always speak the truth. Put away lying, verse 25. Let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we're members of one another. And man, that's true in communal relationship. It's true in a church relationship. You know, we got to walk together. To walk together, we got to be agreed, Amos says in Amos 3 and verse 3. Well, that's important in a marriage relationship too. Talking to one another and being truthful to one another. Bring your Christianity into your marriage. And so when there's an issue, speak up. Don't blow up. Don't clam up. Just speak up. This is what I'm dealing with. This is the problem that I'm facing. And I got to tell you, this will go a long way to say, hey, something happens, and your spouse asks you, hey, is something wrong? Don't say, no, nothing's wrong. Be honest about it. Speak up, not with venom, not with hostility, but clean the air. Speak the truth with one another. And then I'll tell you something else he says. He says, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your wrath. So you solve these matters. Don't go to bed angry with one another. Don't do that. If you do that, you just lay there and you sulk and you're angry and you're resentful and you just can't go to sleep. Don't do that, because the devil will win. You're giving a toehold to the devil. And don't go sleep on the couch. Don't run home to mama. Don't go sleep in a hotel or a car. Get this matter worked out so that you will not give the devil an opportunity to destroy this relationship. You know, it kind of reminds me of a story that I heard about a couple got married. You know, they got kind of like Johnny and June. They got married in a fever, and everything was going well. And then pretty soon, the reality of dealing with day-to-day problems set in, and they had a argument, big argument. So she's all upset, and she gets on the phone. She calls her mama, and she's just crying to mama. And mama can't hardly stand it. She said, "Here, talk to your dad." And so dad gets on the phone, and the daughter's crying, and the dad said, "Whoa, wait, let me ask you something." He said, "What do you want to do?" And she said, "Well, Daddy, I think I want to come home." He said, "You are home." And that solved that matter. Learn to communicate with each other and put away all kinds of corrupt language. And again, Paul is saying in verse 29, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification." He's not talking about obscenities here. That's covered in Colossians 3 and verse 8, putting away all filthy language. He's talking about language that may come up in a situation that will destroy any kind of building up. When you get in a dispute with your spouse and you tell your spouse, "You're stupid," or you just let yourself go. You've just put on a lot of weight. And all of these kinds of things. These are ugly, hateful, scarring words. And that's going to be destructive to any marriage. So, what's the point? The point is, we can do some things to keep our marriages together if we both agree to do these things. And we'll not reach the point that we were talking about very early on of not even knowing what a traditional family is. If we respect the fact that marriage is permanent, respect the fact that we have now formed a companionship, she or he is my companion, and we learn to dialogue, talk, not monologue, communicate with each other. When marriages fail, here's the reality of it. Somebody has failed to live up to what God expects. It's not always both. Sometimes it is both. Sometimes it's just one that fails to live up to what God expects that marriage to be. Marriage is very precious. Sue and I just recently, with the help of God and the goodness of God, celebrated our 57th wedding anniversary. And I'd like to tell you, that's 57 going on forever. Thank you.